Tier lists are dynamic evaluations of subjects' relative positioning within a metagame, as given by an author or community. I value decks by ease of execution, perceived stability within the given pool, and abstract strengths. Welcome to our first tier, decks that win tournaments. These decks are either good and easy to play, or strong enough to make up the difference. Catsith started as a casual deck made by Janky, one of my teammates, somewhere after the release of the Gates of the Underworld structure deck, utilizing Lockcat, the fabled Catsith, and Wind Up Kitten, but perhaps surprisingly giving a contemporary understanding of the deck, no Chaos Sorcerer or fabled Kushano. Beyond being feline-centric, the fabled Unicorn was the win condition, and the deck's name being just the Cat deck at that point belied its hand-matching focus. Janky played the deck on and off until power crapped, and we both left Sanction format somewhere after July 2015. Janky would still play decks based on Catsith and Unicorn in custom formats when we occasionally played those. When we got back into retro formats, part of the reason we preferred Tengu Plant was the legality of Hidden Arsenal of 4. Even then, the deck started out rather rough, still containing Lockcat and other subpar cards, but now crucially played Kushano. The deck was arguably still pretty mid, but the interaction between Catsith and Phoenix Wingwind Blast was enough to merit further tinkering. The real shift occurred when I discovered Darkbug, essentially a dark version of Lockcat, morphing the deck into chaos rather than gimmicky control. Side note, Darkbug isn't good and should probably not see play. This will be discussed in depth later. The final giant leap was the inclusion of Thunder King Ryo. I tested against Janky during the deck's evolution, and we collaborate on the decks we develop as a rule, eventually ending up with the current, now possibly stagnant configuration. So what's the point of this history lesson? Well, firstly, I think it's interesting. Secondly, don't chuck out a new deck if it doesn't perform immediately. It took us months of tinkering with years of prior cat experience to reach this point. Thirdly, what's this deck called? The crux lies in the deck's evolution. The cat deck is legal in every format but good in none. Just jam cards that are cats in your set. Unicorn Control is a slow grindy control deck based on matching hand size and messing with your opponent's mind. I'd say its defining features are Darkbug, Reckless Greed, and running 2 Unicorn in the extra deck. More recently, you'd even see it in Runic Shells as a casual deck.
So this is Runic Fabled!
Also, even here Fabled Lurry is probably comparable to, if not better than Darkbug. Catsith Chaos is a mid-range combo-adjacent Chaos deck that supplements the core of Thunder King, Torghast, and Chaos Sorcerer with a 7-card Catsith package. This deck is notably similar to Chaos Stun, even running Forbidden Lands main deck occasionally. Beyond the Catsith package in specific, this deck almost looks like a spiritual successor to it and relies on many of the same strengths in high-impact normal summons with Chaos follow-up. List currently displayed is based on Pillege deck from Tengu Plant Takeover 10. I'm not a big believer in Stun either as a deck or a concept, but I still think it's infinitely better than running cards like Dimensional Alchemist or Mystic Piper. Alchemist just sucks, honestly. In a similar vein, but for a different reason. Don't combine Piper and Catsith unless you enjoy losing. Catsith wants to trade resources and set cards. Piper wants to punish overextensions. Okay, now that we know the past, what about the current? How do we play this thing? Catsith is a versatile deck, though not as much as, say, Tengu Plant. Unlike that deck, the important decisions are micro, not macro. You typically have only 1, maximum 2 relevant normal summons and even less sequencing choices. The micro choices, on the other hand, such as what to banish with Chaos Sorcerer, are not only difficult but extremely impactful. Overlay before or after battle, banishing Veiler or Unicorn, which brick you discard to Wing Blast, the list goes on. While the deck can generate resources, it is far more apt at simplifying the game. Since even your weaker cards are high quality, no Shineball or Spore in this deck, this generally favors you. On the other hand, Sorcerer only beats Hyperion if summoned afterwards, while Ryo only beats him if summoned beforehand. This is a symptom of this not being a real control deck. In a phrase, the deck needs to deploy controlled aggression. If you're familiar with Who's the Beatdown, link down below, you probably know what's coming. If facing agents, you need to have total control to raise them, versus slower decks like TG, you can take as much time as you want. Every turn you both pass without dealing damage favors you if they have less reach, and them otherwise. The namesake of the deck is the fabled Catsith, and in here the card is really strong. Reading it, that is not fully apparent. I'd play at least 5 copies if I could. It has 800 attack, which is ridiculous for a level 1 monster. It's a light tuner, and it's removal. If your opponent has the misfortune of relying on Skill Drain, Necro Valley, Dragon Ravine, basically any ST remaining face up, bar macro, they will have it popped for free at some point. One of the most common and strongest lines is using Wing Blast, putting their back row on top of their deck and then destroying their monster, leaving them not only with a dead trap on top of the deck, but also open going into your turn. This is especially devastating if done during their end phase. Discarding Kushano to Wing Blast is also pretty common, as it allows you to regain the lost card during your main phase by discarding Catsith then rather than now. The fabled Unicorn itself is a tricky card. Sometimes it's just an above a rate synchro that forces weird sequencing. Other times, such as when dropped with both players having empty hands, it warps the game around it. Yes, resolving Unicorn is very hard for Infinity to beat. Usually you shouldn't aim for Unicorn unless hands are partially depleted. You typically have to invest 2 cards, one of them being Catsith, your best card, to make it, and that loss is hard to recoup. Even worse, better players live with Unicorn more easily. A large part of its value is in beating Gores when going for a game, as Gores triggers in both hand and on field. Your early plays are fairly straightforward. Play Tour Guide searching Kushano, otherwise play Upstart Goblin to dig for it. Next priority is Duality, looking for Ryo, Tour Guide or the other half of Catsith Wingblast. If facing TG, Karakuri or Gadget, an argument can be made to open with Ryo instead. Come mid-game, you want to start deploying Chaos monsters. Ideally you want to play Sorcerer and use turn player priority to get rid of a threat, but if you need a pressure then don't fear dropping just to inflict damage. Wingblast is also great to enable Sorcerer's successful resolution, but can also discard additional copies if you lack Darks in Grave. When choosing a discard target, don't be afraid to ditch cards that are dead this moment if you're under pressure. Sorcerer also matches up surprisingly well versus opposing Veilers on account of your 5 level 1 tuners and Leviar lines. Arcanite Magician and Ancient Sacred Wyvern being so different offers a great deal of versatility here, considering your tuners plus Sorcerer can make either. While Envoy is obviously higher value than Sorcerer, it's important to remember that if you hold both and have only 1 light or dark in graveyard, leading with the one of that attribute allows you to play both this turn rather than leaving one dead in hand if they warning or torrential you. The deck matches up well versus stun decks and slower decks in general. Ironically, the deck struggles somewhat against Gadget, Genix and Karakuri since they can go all in, which Catsith isn't well equipped to deal with. Decks that rely on more fragile combos have a hard time playing into the barrage of Ryu and spellspeed 2 removal. Catsith also on paper beats GK quite comfortably, but in the few recorded head-to-head games they're more or less evenly split. The biggest reason this deck is firmly below Agents and Plants is that it has a slightest advantage against both. The matchups aren't lopsided really, but they're definitely not favored either. Agents are borderline broken and can kill before we can get online. Plants can also kill quickly, although not as fast as Agents, but are instead resilient and always has the possibility of exploding with advantage, turning our carefully managed simplified game into one where they have access to twice as many cards as we do. Lower tier decks, especially those on field spells for continuous spells and traps, that are otherwise lower or has many moving parts become food for our good hands. It honestly feels unfair at times. While Unicorn is merely one tactic of many the deck can employ, it's a huge beating versus some decks. Before I show my take on the deck and discuss card choices, let's go over some rulings and tricks you should know. Catsith is mandatory, which means they can chain Book of Moon on their only face-up monster when you Wingblast to force you to destroy your own cards. Reborn Tengu does not trigger when returned from the field to the deck. You can sometimes even chain to their Searcher to shuffle the Tengu away, or destroy it with Catsith while they're under Duality. Unicorn checks hand size as a resolution of the card in question and can negate counter traps if it is already face-up on the field. It does not start a chain. Effects negated by Effect Veiler still resolve, so Veiler into hand matching when their monster activates its effect result in it being negated and destroyed by Unicorn. If the activation of an effect was negated, such as by Shadow Imprisoning Mirror, then Unicorn will not negate or destroy that monster. This is exceedingly unlikely to come up, but worth knowing. The deck is, as earlier mentioned, stagnant. Common differences include playing only a pair of sorcerers, no upstarts, no lands, and playing Reaper or Darkbug instead of Dark Mimic level 3, although I think most Darks beyond Tour Guide, Sorcerer, Sangan and Gores are fairly equal, which we will get back to. Not playing upstart is probably just wrong, especially in a deck where your last few cards are so much weaker than the first 35 or however many. I'm a firm believer in 3 sorcerers as well, as you're fine seeing multiple copies as long as you see Wingblast or Resolve a Tour Guide. I choose the singleton lands in main deck as you don't like Bottomless Trap Hole or Dimensional Prison and often fight battles with Ryo and Leviathan on both sides, in which lands act as a trump. So, those are the unusual choices. Why then are the standard choices standard? Ryo is a solid standalone card that I feel is significantly overplayed. Contrary to that, I feel the card fits perfectly in this deck as being one of the least bad light monsters you can play that put pressure on your opponent. It often ends up trading quickly, but that's fine, and if it ends up in the graveyard with actively progressing. 2 copies could work, but it would limit your good early turn plays by 15% and there's really no replacement available. Effect Veiler is a really good card all around, given its attribute, effect and usability as a tuner. Earlier versions of the deck maxed out on the card, and I think that's also a decent decision, but drawing multiples is pretty bad, especially if they start the game off with a Tengu or their own Ryo. Tour Guide and Sangan are among the best cards in the format, and we can use them better than probably any deck except maybe Archfiends. Kushano allows a deck to set up a chaos play with only one normal summon and immediately use Catsith. Some builds, especially those with Darkbug, run multiple Kushano, but it comes up too rarely without bug to matter in my opinion. Tour Guide is also by far the best arc for the deck. This is also the reason why I choose to play Dark Mimic. Let me make clear right now that Dark Mimic is not better than Spy, Reaper, Gale, Breaker or any other Dark. The card isn't actively terrible, but it isn't far off either. So why? This is my tier list of dark monsters to play in Catsith, and although the monsters that are dark level 3 fiends all comparatively suck, the sole fact that they can be summoned by tour guide to me puts them in a tier of their own, although not above A tier per se. Tier A and below can often be sided rather than mained. This list is 30 monsters and doesn't even include all options, so let's go quick here. Tier tour guide. Dark Mimic level 3 is a bad Tengu that matches up better versus Ryo and makes you summon for handless. It can crash or wall their tour guides. Jeff Jones played it during Vice's Orlando but didn't top, so maybe that says something. Night Assailant can destroy a monster, or if you play other flip effects can be discarded to Wing Blast to add them back. Dark Resonator can wall an attack and it's a tuner. Possessed Dark Soul is fun if you max either tour guide and cancel random monsters. The effect is permanent for what it's worth. Gene Releaser of Rituals has 2000 defense and 1000 turn attack, plus you might throw your opponent off game 1. If a Necromancer has worse attack than Gene but can be summoned in defense. Crash Bagwai has shared highest attack with Brow and better defense, but Brow has a potential better effect. Tier A. Gravekeeper Spy as the number 1 pick is sketchy given its breakout performance was in the recent Toronto Winter Championship piloted by Gustafsson. It's an early game wall that matches up decently well versus Venus and Ryo while allowing Trishula, Arcanite, Radiant and more depending on which tuner you hold. Being able to summon a second Spy and overlay for Utopia immediately puts a light and 2 darks in rotation. Spirit Reaper is the most common inclusion and has utility both on offense and defense. I've never liked the card so I'm biased here, but I think it's still better than the vast majority of options even though it was my first cut after playing the deck. Gale is untested but being another card to win the Leviathan Ryo War is relevant. It also beats Spy and Reaper while being a decent top tick into an established board. Breaker the Magical Warrior forces opposing interruptions similar to Ryo. It's purely for offensive pressure unlike Ryo which has a floodgate effect and is relevant during their turn. DD Crow is dead versus too many decks to be placed higher but is excellent in the side deck and by far the best dark versus plants, Regunity, Zombie and the like, and it can win games randomly versus Reborn or Avarice. Tier B. Mask of Darkness gives you more Wing Blast to make the discard cost less painful in a pinch. You can also convert to Raging with Kushan or Unicorn with Cerberell. Darkbug was often included in early versions but it is not good in my opinion, being an underpowered brick. You know who else agrees?
Hey, you. Yeah, I'm talking to you. Don't play Darkbug.
It matches up poorly versus Vader and Maxi, which normally aren't that strong versus you. Having a measly 100 attack makes it weaker than even Lockat, and its dead until Kushan is engraved, often incentivizing a second Kushan and now it costs 2 slots. Compared to Fabled Lurry, which can be discarded to Kushana for the same effect, dodges Vader, doesn't leave a weak monster in attack if disrupted, works with Wing Blast and doesn't necessarily cost your normal summon. Darkbug has only one advantage, it being Dark attribute. Plaguespeeder Zombie gives potential access to 2 tuners and is a different level from Vader and Cat. Kaiku is a beating for most decks if it does connect and prevents Agents and other Chaos decks from playing well on the field. Losing to Ryo and often just dying makes it less desirable. Snipe Hunter allows you to turbo Chaos monsters by discarding from hand and can be annoying for back row decks to deal with. It also cannot be stopped by Stardust Struggle, My Body as a shield or the like. Vanity's Fiend is an unexpected trump, but without Hamster, Spy or Reaper you often lack Tribute Fodder. Caius is like Vanity's Fiend but aims to simplify the game rather than lock the opponent out. Mechlord Emperor Visel can be summoned in the mirror when they Catsith versus heroes if they spark your monster. While I couldn't find an official ruling, it does miss timing according to the Judge program like other cards with similar wording do. Necrogarden is a level 3 with an effect that can be impactful. Tier C. Green Kappa can win games going second. Don Salug is similar to but significantly worse than Reaper. It can punish Torgate Sangan openings better and sometimes setting it can trigger the effect randomly. Phantom of Chaos can copy discarded Chaos monsters to stop a Sangan search if copying Ryo. If you have a Leviathan in the graveyard it can also attack over their Ryos. Durador can destroy opposing sorcerers, most Gravekeepers, Gorse, Tragedia, Malefics and Reaper. Tragoidia is not good in Catsith since your levels are bad for taking opposing monsters and you typically have a small hand. Sephiroth is a decent discard for Wing Blast but a huge brick otherwise and we run no Call of the Haunted to recycle. Dark Mimic level 1 can draw a card or level up if it survives. Kuribo can put itself in the graveyard and potentially surprise an opponent. There's 2 more darks I'd call untiered, the first being Dark Arm Dragon. This deck typically runs 8 to 10 darks, which on paper is enough to support it. In practice, those darks get banished, and games where you could resolve it, such as when opening Torgate and resolving Sangan, you're already winning. The other is Doom Caliber Knight, which isn't a good card in general and hurts yourself more than the opponent in most cases. With that detour complete, let's move on. The staples in Mind Control, Heavy Storm, Monster Reborn, Darkhold and Book of Moon probably need little explanation. I'll say that this deck uses Mind Control better than most decks. Book of Moon doesn't see as much play as it should in my opinion, although it is possible it should be replaced by a second Lance or something similar. I think Book is better than most traps. 3 Duality, 3 Upstart gives maximum access to our good early turn plays. I think it's plausible that Duality should be played at 2 rather than 3, being the only card that was often dead when I played the deck, though the consistency hit might make me go back to maxing it immediately. The trap lineup is fairly standard, running all the good ones on the list plus the 3 Wing Blast. Some players prefer a Gecko Break and Janky has toyed with Karma Cat before. It's possible we'd want a mix or more than 3, but I really like Wing Blast essentially giving information on their next draw, not triggering Tengu and making it harder for them to drop cards like Sorcerer and Hyperion, all things which Gecko Break and Karma Cat cannot do. As earlier stated, I would run 5 Catf if I could, and I would probably run 4 Wing Blast as well in that occasion. In the side deck, we have Gale as a Swiss armor knife to hit any early play that would be difficult to deal with. Even halving a Christie or Hyperion isn't too shabby as the clock is cut in half. It, along with Crow, also serve the dual purpose of being dark. You can sub in for Dark Mimic or your dark of choice. Having access to at least 1 Crow is pretty important to me, but it's been kind of unimpressive in this deck and I might end up cutting it altogether. Electric Virus is not only a level 3 light that you can almost freely discard in the matchups where you bring it in, but for the same reason that this deck uses Mind Control so well, it also utilizes the electric body for profit. Max C needs to be in the 55 and is part of the reason I went with 1 Virus, since in matchups like Karakura and Dragunity you'd side them anyway. Tengu Plant isn't the easiest matchup either, and this is among the best cards versus them. Vanity's Fiend is probably gonna lose a lot of value if it ever becomes more widely played, but for now it will usually blindside an opponent to decide that Veiler and Crow was the play versus you. I can't justify more than one copy since it's often a hard brick and side deck space is limited. Normally you'd want access to 3 Typhoons after siding, but Catsith has a ton of removal already, so I felt okay with shaving 1 copy. This is also questionable and there's no fault running 3. If cards like Macrocosmos and Dragon Ravine didn't exist, Forbidden Lands would be better here anyway. Speaking of, a second copy of Lands in the side deck. Versus TG without skill drain, Lands is superior. It also matches up better versus Gemini Spark. It's hard to emphasize how much better Lands is in this deck than it looks. Janky ran it, but I wasn't a believer myself until I tested it. My body as a shield is good against stun decks with lots of destruction and versus Ajet where it stops both Herald and Hyperion. It also has some use in stopping Catsith in the mirror match. Nobleman is just something to have versus decks like X-Saber, Gravekeeper, Zombie and other random decks you might face. If Spy, especially 3 Spy, becomes standard, it could potentially see play in the mirror even. Bottomless Trap Hole punishes opponents who know that the standard list doesn't play those, as well as being almost godly versus Rush Rhino and one of the best outs to Venus provided you draw it beforehand. Blackhorn fulfills a similar role, but is obviously better versus Trishul and its ilk. Creature Swap was chosen over what originally was the second Blackhorn as an out to cards you'd normally Soul Taker. You often have stray monsters like Kushano that can be swapped for profit. It's possible this should be a Lightning Vortex or something else, but neither really shine versus Venus openings anyway. The extra deck is really tight, owing to the need to play 3 level 7s as well as Fabled Synchros. The 7s are so different, it's hard to remove any of them and the flexibility they add is strong. Running both Unicorn and Armor Arm, or in the same vein Catastor and Raging can seem overkill, but really needed generic options that are also more flexible in their uses than the Fabled Synchros. Not playing any 6 is obviously wrong, and Bryonak allowing you to discard Catsith is quite nice. 2 level 8 Synchros is maybe overkill considering it's among the rarest level you access, but both cards are very powerful in their own right while also being totally distinct. Trishula is obviously too good not to run, even though you have no clear lines into it without running Spy. Utopia rarely comes up, but it's come up enough for me that I rarely don't play it in any deck at this point. Losing due to a lack of Utopia feels terrible and is worse. I choose to spend the 1 flex slot on a second Leviathan Dragon as it seemed the most likely to come up in theory. The other most common choices are Chimera Tech, Ancient Fair Dragon or a second copy of Unicorn. Now that we've covered the past and the current, what about the future? Which exclusions to serve mention? Which cards could be played? After Spirit Reaper, Scapegoat is probably the most common inclusion not featured here. I like goats and think the card is very good, but it's never panned out either for me or Janky in practice. Part of the reason, as I understand it, is that it necessitates the inclusion of Formula Synchro in the extra deck. Even if the card can technically be ran without Formula, part of the power of summoning level 1 non-tuners is tied to that card. Maybe if additional synergies were included, like more Creature Swap or a second Kushano, its power would shine brighter. Once again, if a slot in practice takes multiple slots, the expected value is lower than it might appear at first. The most obvious modification to the deck is to include more Fableds or cards adjacent to them. I absolutely bodied Janky while I was playing mediocre Tengu Catsith, with a Catsith deck utilizing Super Nimble Mega Hamster, Rhycolite Hunter, the Fabled Cerberel and Monster Incarnation, which in turn led him to test those cards. Cerberel doesn't do anything by itself even when discarded, which is the biggest strike against it. One thing I do like about Cerberel is that it allows you to comfortably play Fabled Leviathan in the extra deck. While the effect isn't the easiest to resolve nor the most powerful even when resolved, being able to turn Gorz or Kayan plus Kushano into something is decent. Mind controlling Trishula to synchro with Catsith or Puppet Plant on the Shining plus Cerberel is also neat, but not much beyond that. Fabled Cruise is even worse than Cerberel. In a deck featuring around 8 Fabled with Mill included, it bricked constantly anyway. I think the card is reserved for pure Fabled. As if that wasn't obvious. Hamster requires at least 3 slots for 2 hamsters and 1 Raikou to play comfortably, likely even more, and then you're probably giving up Riots or whatever extra darks you had, making the deck slower and less consistent. I think a wholly new approach is needed to play Catsith and Hamster together. When it works, it does work well at least. The last main deck Fabled of note, touched upon before, is Lurry. It shares many problems with Fabled Cerberel, but unlike that it can convert with its primary trigger, that of Kushano. If you want to tunnel Unicorn more, this is probably the card for you, but in my opinion that is not playing to the deck's strengths. Another option for pushing Unicorn beyond Bug and Lurry is to go back to basics and play Lockcat. The primary draw of Lockcat is the fact that it's a level 3, allowing you to convert off of it easier if they stop it, and its vastly higher attack stat allowing it to beat opposing tour guides. There are also 2 more Fabled Synchros, Valkyrus and Kudabi. Neither are worth the slot, being harder to make and more situational than other Synchros of the same level. Valkyrus' effect is nice to get rid of Gorz late game, and he has a meaty attack of 2900, but is basically only summonable via Gorz Mind Control or Reborn. While Kudabi isn't useless and can stall in niche situations, I can honestly say that the best part of the card is its bizarre artwork. In other words, not recommended. Cyber Dragon is a decent light that shouldn't take too much haggling to sell. It beats Rios and matches well up versus Tengu while not costing us our normal summon. If included in the main deck, I'd only play a single copy as it is the dark count, not light, that we want to increase. In the side deck, it's as solid as always, but I think Electric Virus not necessitating an extra deck slot edges it out. Cyber Dragon isn't used only for Chimera Tech, but it feels like leaving money on the table to run one without the other. For something completely different to Cyber Dragon's solid baseline, Instant Fusion is pure gas. It gives us a Dark in Flame Ghost, Dark Fire Dragon or Reaper on the Nightmare, or one of the 3 level 5 light options. I know I've hammered this point a lot, but the extra deck doesn't have much room. Instant Fusion's opportunity cost goes even further than that, as you're paying premium for the ability to choose level, type and attribute. The card is weak to max C, and the life point cost, while not a major deterrent, is still a disadvantage. To continue the theme, there's a few synchros beyond the Fables that could see play. Orient Dragon and Guy Knight have some use cases, but we rarely make 6s, and since our most realistic line for making them utilize Kushano, we'd likely be better off making Bryonak or Leviathan instead. On the other hand, I'd really want to run Hyper Librarian. It's a dark that beats opposing Catasters and Sorcerers and can draw cards off of their place. Since we don't synchro that much anyway, it's too likely to be a wasted slot, but still, the card is just so good. While going over darks, I mentioned Tourguide targets but obviously only included dark monsters. Tourguide can summon fiends, not dark or light of course, but those should not see play in my opinion. The most obviously good targets are Grenmayo the Asa, which is a strong late game card if hard drawn. Claudian Poison Cloud can be summoned to out a monster at a sometimes hefty life point cost. Finally, Quackamaru Doom has the highest attack of all possible targets, but the maintenance cost isn't negated by Tourguide, and if summoned without being negated, the card hurts us more than most opponents. I'd seriously never run any of these. If we'd want to go harder for Unicorn, perhaps including Lockcat already, the fabled Ganasha is potentially usable. Banishing itself is some downside, but with that amount of beasts, maybe you'd even be able to play Horn of the Phantom Beast. That brings the deck closer to another existing deck, which I will not name, but it does include the fabled Cockataur and multiple horns. For a 118 direction, we could choose to go closer to stun and play more real traps like Dimensional Prison and maybe even Starlight Road. If that's the play, then we'd have to remove something like Veiler or Sorcerer in addition to the 2 flex spots, since I cannot in good conscience suggest dropping Wing Blast or the filter spells. Another great trap that is close to playable here is Call of the Haunted, since in theory we have both bosses and Sangan to recur, as well as Ryos and even Unicorn to make extra interruptions. The most controversial card in the game can of course also be included in the main deck. I do not think Maxi is very good main here though, especially not without Cerberel. I do like it main in some decks, but typically in decks like Tengu Plant or Zombie where you want to grind into a really big push. While it can be really effective with Unicorn on board, it not being chaos material firmly puts it below Veiler and arguably even Crow in my opinion. It's obviously good when sided still. While on the topic of pretending to be another deck, the Plant engine or part of it can be played. Glow Up by its lonesome allows 1-for-1 and scapegoating and a lot of power, and Dandelion is a great card for Wing Blast, essentially being too lurry but with the upside of being a far better normal summon. Ultimately, especially if including Lone Fire or Debris, we're adding normal summons and only 1-2 accelerants in 1-for-1 and Foolish Burial, if that's even worth. While I won't say it never will be, I do think the lack of synergy is too much, and a deck playing both Fables and Plants should start with a Plant core rather than a Chaos core. For the last card following this round, we have Enemy Controller. In a build with more disposable bodies like Darkbug, it could work. It's especially nice to dodge opposing Veiler since those tend to stop your early tour guides, but since you summon a level 3, it's not the easiest to convert a stolen monster with whatever you brought with tour guide. Beyond that, the card isn't stellar here. I definitely prefer Utopia to Roach, but in a build without Spy, it does have some merit as a way to convert Ryo or whatever monster into a dark. My opinion of steals from Roach in general isn't very high, and losing Ryo to summon Roach is nearly always a downgrade. Since your other 4s are limited to Armory Arm, Unicorn, Mind Control and Reborn, and the card is comparatively weak, I'd stay clear of that idea. Reckless Greed used to be a mainstay in the deck, even without Unicorn focus. The ability to draw 2 with so many high impact cards is a welcome boost and allows you to pseudo combo into a kill. While I don't think it's a bad choice, it costs 3 slots and the deck already has a problem of having a higher count of situational cards. If running Reckless without a heavy Unicorn focus, shaving Dualities or Upstart is arguably even worse than it already would be. Don't grief yourself, accept Hoban into your heart. Another card similar to Reckless, which I really like, is Legacy of Yatagarasu. It doesn't need to be maxed to be effective, and unless top decked when in a tight situation, it's rarely dead. Until I realized how good Lance was, it was my last card in the deck, and remains my 41st. The deck is already borderline versus Decree, and adding either Reckless or Legacy exaggerates that weakness, which is also another hidden cost of running the card. If you do decide that 2 Legacy is the play, I'd consider splitting between Jar of Greed and Legacy to give the impression of running more than 2 copies. The secondary effect of Legacy is broken if it resolves, so I leave that exact choice up to you, but I'd rather take the higher win rate versus decks that don't play Spirit rather than versus those that do. One card that has been experimented with in this deck is Chain Disappearance, primarily as a side deck choice versus Agents. If you can resolve it early, the card can do wonders, but is fighting the deck on the wrong axis, I feel. Its primary strength lies in banishing your own Torgir in response to a Veiler, taking their 3 copies with it. It's also decent versus a lot of cards in the Plant deck, but at that point I'd rather play Crow. Another card that Janky often used to side was Mind Crush, which has some interesting uses with Unicorn calling Mechanical Chaser or whatever to match their hand in addition to its normal use cases. While a cute play, it's not enough to make the card playable by itself, so it has to live and die by its normal strengths. I'm not a fan of Mind Crush in general, but it is good versus some decks including Agents and Heroes if you feel comfortable with your reads. The final card I want to highlight is Monster Incarnation, which I feel is probably not correct for this deck but is very close to playable in some sort of Chaos Fabled shell. Beyond the obvious use of triggering Fables, being able to bring back Tour Guide gives you a second shot at resolving it if they Warning or Veiler. Late game it can return Envoy, even one whose summon was negated, making it superior to Reborn in select situations. Due to how trigger effects work in non-public locations in Tengu Plant, you can discard Catsith and return that same card to your hand while still getting its trigger effect. It's very versatile but also a huge brick, and I would probably never run more than one in a deck similar to this. Catsith is one of Tengu Plant format's newest top decks, and the one to put Chaos back in tier 1. It's very fun, different and skill intensive, and I don't see it leaving anytime soon. That's all I've got, and thanks for watching.